the WNBA and Players Association to continue to negotiate in good faith. So this news in itself kind of doesn't change anything. Basically what's going to happen is the players in the league are going to continue doing what they've been doing. If they made another extension for another 30 days or another 2 weeks or another whatever, it honestly doesn't matter. Until there's a lockout or a strike or an agreement is made, like those are the only times that something really changes in what is currently happening at the moment. And Breanna Stewart actually alluded to this in an interview.
This was never meant to breathe, never meant to escape the locked rooms, the encrypted inboxes, the hushed late-night calls where power speaks without witnesses. But the moment it leaked, the WNBA's entire future cracked open. And what spilled out wasn't gossip, it was gasoline. What you're reading about right now was supposed to stay buried behind closed doors, sealed inside confidential emails and whispered conference calls where no cameras roll, no microphones listen, and no fans are allowed to peek behind the curtain. Because this wasn't a harmless internal disagreement or routine off-season noise, this was a decision so sharp, so final, that insiders say it was repeated like a commandment behind the scenes. Kathy made the decision, no debate, no delay, no public framing, just a clean, ruthless cut that instantly removed 5 of the most powerful, recognizable, and influential names connected to the WNBA's long-term vision for 2026. And the reason this moment matters more than any recent league controversy is because it exposed something players have quietly feared for years, that loyalty in this league may have an expiration date that has nothing to do with performance, leadership, or legacy. It has everything to do with control. According to multiple insiders, this wasn't about trades, rotations, or short-term roster shuffling, and it definitely wasn't framed as a financial necessity in the traditional sense, because if this were simply about money, there would have been conversations, negotiations, warnings, something resembling respect, but instead there was silence, followed by leaks, followed by chaos, and that silence screamed louder than any press release ever could. Because when a league that usually rushes to get ahead of narratives suddenly says nothing at all, it's not because nothing happened, it's because something too big happened to spin. And while fans were still focused on highlights and off-season speculation, players were already boiling, because at the same time this decision was being quietly finalized, the WNBA was already falling behind on the most basic off-season responsibilities. The kind of operational failures that make people inside the league ask uncomfortable questions about leadership priorities. No full season schedule released. No clear timeline for expansion drafts despite 2 new teams coming. No transparency about how the off-season calendar was supposed to function, especially when just a year ago, by this same point, the league had already completed the Golden State Valkyries expansion draft and released the following season's schedule, which makes the sudden quiet now feel less like coincidence and more like avoidance. Media members barely pressed the issue, fans were left guessing, and players noticed. Because when deadlines slip and explanations disappear, it sends a message that decision-makers are focused elsewhere. And that elsewhere turned out to be a ruthless internal reset that no one outside the top floor was invited to discuss. It started quietly, as these things always do, with late-night calls that weren't on calendars, emergency meetings that weren't announced, executives speaking in half sentences like they were afraid even walls might be listening, and then, inevitably, someone leaked just enough of an internal message to light the entire league on fire. Not a draft memo, not a proposal, not language suggesting review or evaluation, but a single word that carries finality: cut. 5 players removed from long-term planning, erased from the 2026 vision, and once that word reached the wrong phones, the league lost control of the narrative instantly, because agents reacted first, and when agents react, phones don't stop buzzing, and when phones don't stop buzzing, players start calling each other asking the same question on repeat: is this real? And within hours, what began as private panic spilled into group chats, then into social media whispers, then into mainstream discussion, all while the league stayed silent, a silence that confirmed more than any denial ever could. Insiders say the outrage wasn't just about the decision itself, it was about how it was made. Because this call did not come from a committee, it wasn't debated publicly, it didn't involve player representatives in advance. And it certainly didn't come with the courtesy of a warning. It came from the very top, and that's what shattered trust. Veteran players reportedly felt blindsided, some learning through whispers, others seeing screenshots of internal language before hearing a single official word from the league, and one source described the mood inside multiple locker rooms as ice cold. Not loud anger, not dramatic protests, but the kind of stunned quiet that happens when people realize the ground under them isn't as solid as they were promised. Another insider said it felt like betrayal, because the names being whispered weren't fringe players or aging role pieces. They were champions, leaders, faces of the league, women who carried franchises through losing seasons, who showed up for marketing campaigns, who answered media questions, who mentored younger players, and who believed that building the league meant something beyond being a temporary asset. Financial justifications didn't help, because while figures like $700 million in projected losses were floated in background conversations, the union reportedly believes those projections are exaggerated, and many around the league quietly point out that if the deal were truly that manageable, if losses were really spread across 20 teams over 7 years at roughly $5 million per team annually, this agreement would already be signed, because owners routinely absorb far greater short-term losses when long-term franchise values are skyrocketing, which Sportico has already documented, making the financial argument feel less like a necessity and more like a shield. And then the names started circulating, and everything escalated. Breanna Stewart's name hit first, and the shockwaves were immediate, because Stewart isn't just a star, she's an era. Then came Chelsea Gray, then Alyssa Thomas, then Jewel Lloyd, then Kelsey Plum, and with every additional name, disbelief hardened into fear, because consistency in whispers is what separates rumor from reality. Fans didn't want to believe it, players struggled to accept it, but the question that landed hardest was also the simplest: if this can happen to them, who's next? Suddenly conversations expanded to Aya Wilson, to Angel Reese, to anyone whose value to the league felt undeniable, and still there were no confirmations, no denials, just more silence, which allowed anxiety to metastasize. Behind the scenes, emotions boiled over, not because players feared competition, but because they felt disrespected, insulted, reduced to line items on a spreadsheet, with one veteran reportedly saying, "They built this league on our backs, and now they're cutting us like numbers," while another described it as punishment disguised as progress. That frustration collided with an already volatile moment in the league, where debates about Caitlin Clark's impact, Angel Reese's comments, and the balance between on-court and off-court value have pushed the WNBA to a flashpoint, because regardless of personal opinions, ratings, sponsorships, and visibility have undeniably surged, franchise valuations are climbing, and the CBA is expiring at the end of the month, meaning tension was already stretched thin before this decision ever leaked. And that's what makes this moment different, because this wasn't just a shot across the bow, it landed during the most sensitive phase of the league's calendar, when trust is currency and transparency is leverage, yet what players received instead was secrecy, followed by chaos. As outrage grew, league offices reportedly went into full damage control mode, emergency calls, lawyers looped in, PR teams rewriting statements again and again, searching for language that wouldn't pour fuel on the fire, but the problem was structural, not verbal, because fans began questioning everything. Why now? Why these players? Why in secret? And insiders say the answer has little to do with basketball and everything to do with control, contracts, long-term flexibility, and a desire for a cleaner, younger, more manageable image heading into 2026. But to the players, that explanation sounded brutal, because the message underneath it all was simple and terrifying: you're expendable. And once that message spreads, trust doesn't just crack, it evaporates. Conversations are already happening behind closed doors, nothing public yet, nothing official, but private meetings, contingency planning, and quiet preparation suggest players are bracing for worst-case scenarios. Especially as off-season timelines continue slipping, expansion drafts remain undefined, free agency looms, and the league's organizational history gives little confidence that delays will magically resolve themselves. This wasn't just about 5 names, it was about power, about who controls the league's direction, WH. The moment the first name surfaced, the league didn't just lose control of the story, it lost control of the room, because fear spreads faster than facts. And once players realized silence was the strategy, panic became the language. What followed the initial leak wasn't chaos in the loud, public sense, it was something far more dangerous, a quiet unraveling that crept through locker rooms, agent offices, sponsor meetings, and union calls like a slow-burning fire. Because once Breanna Stewart's name began circulating with alarming consistency, the conversation inside the WNBA shifted from disbelief to survival. And insiders say that's when the tone changed completely. Players stopped asking whether the information was accurate and started asking how to protect themselves if it was. Stewart's name alone carried enough weight to destabilize confidence across the league, because she represents not just elite performance, but continuity, credibility, and championship identity. So when whispers placed her on a list allegedly marked for removal from long-term planning, it sent a message no memo ever could, that legacy was no longer a shield. Then came Chelsea Gray, a floor general whose leadership has anchored championship runs, followed by Alyssa Thomas, the embodiment of toughness and consistency, then Jewel Lloyd, a franchise cornerstone, and Kelsey Plum, a marketing engine as much as a scoring threat, and with each addition, the whispers gained structure, pattern, and intent, transforming from rumor into what many players privately described as a blueprint. That's when fear crossed the line into anger, because if stars of that caliber could be quietly erased from the league's 2026 vision without warning, consultation, or public justification, then no resume was strong enough, no contribution permanent enough, and no promise binding enough to guarantee security. Players began replaying every recent interaction with league officials in their heads, scrutinizing language, tone, and timing, wondering what had already been decided without them knowing, because the absence of communication suddenly felt intentional rather than accidental. And that sense of intentional silence collided violently with an already fragile off-season, one defined by missed deadlines, vague timelines, and a growing perception that leadership was overwhelmed or distracted at precisely the moment clarity was most needed. The expansion timeline alone became a flashpoint, because with 2 new teams entering the league, the lack of a clearly announced expansion draft date wasn't just an administrative oversight, it was a red flag, signaling that the league was either unprepared or unwilling to commit publicly to a process that directly affects player livelihoods. When the Toronto Tempo themselves subtly mocked the delay by tweeting about big things coming alongside a schedule release that should have been done in December, it underscored how visible the dysfunction had become, not just to fans, but to the very organizations betting on the league's future. Players noticed that too, because when expansion teams are more transparent than the league office itself, it creates a vacuum of trust, and vacuums get filled with speculation, resentment, and worst-case assumptions. Inside union circles, conversations reportedly turned urgent, not dramatic, but methodical, focused on contingency planning rather than protest, because the Players Association understood that this wasn't a single incident, it was a signal. The alleged justification floating around back channels centered on projected losses of roughly $700 million over the life of a new deal only deepened skepticism, because to veteran players and seasoned agents, the math didn't add up in a league where franchise valuations are climbing rapidly and long-term growth is the stated goal. Spread across 20 teams over 7 years, those losses equate to figures that many owners absorb annually in other ventures without blinking, especially when the payoff is increased market presence, media deals, and brand value, which made the insistence on austerity feel less like prudence and more like leverage. That perception hardened when players realized the decision allegedly wasn't brought to them as a problem to solve collectively, but as a conclusion already reached, delivered after the fact through leaks rather than leadership. And while league insiders insist the move was about structure, flexibility, and future control rather than individual worth, the messaging failed catastrophically, because what players heard wasn't reset, it was replace, and what they felt wasn't motivation, it was erasure. This tension spilled into broader debates already simmering across the league, particularly around star power, marketing priorities, and the disproportionate scrutiny placed on certain players like Caitlin Clark, whose presence has undeniably altered ratings, attendance, and sponsorship dynamics.